after the pay-go requirements, that's not paid for. Most of us probably won't be around when the bill comes due for this never-ending deficit spending here in Washington. Pay-go requirements. But sadly, our children and our grandchildren will be. Most of us probably won't be around. The politicians in Washington spend now to buy votes, but conveniently won't be around to deal with the consequences. We can do hard infrastructure. Again, that's a worthy goal. But we can do it without shoveling more debt on the backs of our children and to our grandchildren. Indeed, if we just limited this bill to hard infrastructure, it would be paid for. As I said, there are good and bad ways to achieve noble ends. The second reason that I'm opposed to this legislation is because of its big government, top-down approach. It includes many half-baked components that deserve far more scrutiny. Rather than compete against China, using our unparalleled innovation, our ingenuity, our technology, we're substituting massive government control to dictate, to fund, and to decide winners and losers. That's not the American way. We're using the cryptocurrency market as a pay-for. Have we fully vetted how this new regulation and taxation will affect this rapidly developing industry? We wind up ceding this industry to others because of this regulation. What's the point of even having committees in the Senate with expertise in certain matters if the most significant legislation that passes this body doesn't even go through them? The whole point of committees is to use them. Use these committees to carefully scrutinize and refine important legislation. Use the committees to prevent unintended consequences that result from rushed legislation. Yet this is a 2,700-page bill that is going through no committees. Once again, we have to pass it to find out what's in it, and then learn what kind of unintended consequences we can expect. The third reason I'm frustrated with this legislation is because it's tied to what I believe is the Democrats' real ambition, which is their multi-trillion-dollar march to socialism that they will unveil right after this infrastructure legislation is passed. Democrats have admitted this. This is their plan. The far left wing of the Democrat Party, which is effectively calling the shots these days, is demanding that Democrats here in Congress spend trillions of dollars to reshape American society, to make American citizens more dependent on their government. Their aim seems to be to turn the United States into a sclerotic, government-controlled state, just like Western Europe. The upcoming legislation that we're talking about now is the third leg of the stool of the Democrats' overall plan. The first leg is to pack the Supreme Court, so the Constitution no longer gets in the way of the plan. The second is to federalize and take over voting laws and procedures, ensuring Democrats will never lose another election, propelling themselves into perpetual power over both the legislative branch and the executive branch. And third, they want to remake the United States economy and America's relationship with government into one where Americans begin to look to government for everything, from Green New Deal programs to daycare. In this world, American citizens will be less free, less prosperous, but more captive and hooked on government programs. That means they'll be more dependent on Democrats and the institutions that they control. So far, Democrats have been unable to build legs 1 and 2 of the stool, but they're actively trying. President Biden has a court-packing commission ongoing, and the Democratic leader is today working on scheduling more votes on the election takeover. They're desperate to appease left-wing extremists that have all of the energy in their party because they need these extremists' support to win elections. Yet they've stalled out on their first 2 goals, so they've come up with a scheme to build the third leg of their stool. They previewed phase 1 of this scheme in March when they spent $1.9 trillion in the name of COVID relief. Of course, 90% of it had nothing to do with COVID. It was really just a payoff to their most loyal political supporters. Sadly, it's now causing the highest inflation that we've seen in decades. This inflation is a daily tax on every American who has to buy goods and services here in America. But phase 2 of the scheme is even more devious. Step 1, change the conversation to trillions with a T. Make billions sound small. condition the Congress, condition the media, condition the American public to these big numbers. Remember, $1 trillion is an astronomical number, and our children are going to have to pay for it. Step 2, tell the United States that America needs infrastructure, but then redefine the term infrastructure to include government dependency programs. Really muddy it up. Step 4, when more reasonable Democrats in the Senate balk at some of these more expensive or egregious items, promise them a 2-track process, one for hard infrastructure and one for social programs. Step 5, negotiate as much of your socialist wish list into the infrastructure track as you can. They got some of it into this bill, but not all of it. They'll just put the rest of it into the wish list and put that wish list into the government dependency bill that's yet to come. Step 6, pass the infrastructure bill through the Senate as quickly as possible. Drop a nearly 3,000-page bill and demand that it be passed immediately before we can even understand or scrutinize what's in it. The Trojan horse, my friends, is through the gate. Step 7, hold that infrastructure bill hostage in the House of Representatives until everything you couldn't get into the infrastructure bill, particularly meaning the trillions of dollars in government dependency programs, are passed through the Senate. Therefore, Nancy Pelosi has promised that this bill will never become law until it's joined at the hip with the multi-trillion-dollar socialist bill. More on that in a minute. Step 8, say that the president won't sign the infrastructure bill into the law if it's not accompanied by trillions of dollars in government dependency programs. President Biden already did this before he clumsily walked it back, but we saw and we heard what he was thinking. Step 9, to get the government dependency programs part passed, circumvent the filibuster in the Senate by abusing an arcane loophole called reconciliation. Reconciliation was intended to save taxpayer dollars and assure passage of an annual budget for the federal government. But no, they're using this process, they're abusing this procedure to pass trillions of dollars of government dependency program with only 50 Democrat votes. Step 10, give reasonable Democrats political cover to support the parliamentary trick in the government dependency spending by saying it unlocks the ability for their hard-fought infrastructure bill that passed the Senate, and by the way is now being held hostage in the House, to finally get through the House and to the president's desk. Wait a minute. What just happened? Abracadabra, the American people are so confused by the Democrat sleight of hand, they don't even notice that their wallet has been stolen and that their country has been fundamentally changed. My question is simple. If these policies, these spendings are so good, why does getting it done take a parliamentary house of mirrors? There can't be a bipartisan deal on infrastructure if its enactment into law requires later tacking on all of the socialist wish list items that got excluded from the deal. Democrats have telegraphed these plans. You just have to pay attention. The President of the United States, right after announcing the infrastructure deal, said it would be held hostage on his desk without the trillions of dollars of government dependency spending alongside it. President Biden specifically said this: I expect that in the coming months this summer, before the fiscal year is over, that we will have voted on this bill, the infrastructure bill, as well as voted on the budget resolution. But if only one comes to me, this is the one that only comes to me, I'm not signing it. It's in tandem. Later, in response to a question, President Biden revealed, look, the bipartisan bill from the very beginning was understood. There was going to have to be the second part of it, he said. I'm not just signing the bipartisan bill and forgetting about the rest. Now, he's later tried to muddy up the waters on this because he said too much. But if you read his cleanup statement carefully, he never took back his vow. He never said he would sign the bipartisan bill without having alongside it the partisan multi-trillion-dollar bill. The Speaker of the House has said the same thing repeatedly. On June 24th, she said, there ain't going to be a bipartisan bill without a reconciliation bill. She added again, quote, let me be really clear on this. We will not take a bill in the House until the Senate passes the bipartisan bill and a reconciliation bill. A month later, on July 22nd, Speaker Pelosi again said, quote, we will not take up the infrastructure bill until the Senate passes the reconciliation measure. It only takes one Democrat to end this insanity, to stand up and say he or she won't participate in this scheme, that would change the entire tenor of this debate and this process. So while I believe in hard infrastructure, I cannot participate in doing it this way. First, by including in this bill a bunch of things that aren't hard infrastructure. And the result of that is throwing $250 billion more debt at our children and our grandchildren. And secondly, and most importantly for the future of this country, enabling this quadruple bank shot attempt by Democrats to thread their government dependency fantasy through a House and a Senate that are divided by the narrowest of margins by holding this bill once it passes hostage in the House. The stakes here are too high. America is an exceptional nation. We're distinct from all others throughout history. We're exceptional because we provided more freedom and opportunity than any other. President Lincoln called it the last best hope of Earth. Ever since, it's fulfilled that promise for countless generations. We must fight to preserve our American system and the American dream, not in a tornado of hurried legislative activity that will seal its decline. I'm asking my colleagues to fight for this country's future. Our children and grandchildren deserve to have the same sort of wonderful opportunity that our parents and grandparents gave us. We need to make certain that they have a future for them that is better than today. And we're duty-bound to make certain that it happens. That's why I ran for office. Let's work together on infrastructure. Out from under the rapidly approaching cloud of socialism, let's make this happen a different way. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Tennessee?
I am, we are not in a quorum call, are we?
No, we're not, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to concur with my colleague from Tennessee in his beautifully stated remarks and the way he has brought forward the frustration that Tennesseans have. You know, Mr. President, I had the opportunity to be at home yesterday. We have a great event going on in Nashville this weekend. It is called the Grand Prix. And I had the opportunity to be at the opening event with a lot of women, small business owners. I had the opportunity later in the day to go cut the ribbon for a big county fair and see lots of families and talk to families that were there. And you know what, Mr. President? They are completely confused with what is going on. See, Tennesseans are really smart. They watch what is happening in Washington, D.C., and they are so concerned about the future and about freedom and freedom's cause. And they continue to say, as my colleague from Tennessee stated, they want the best for their children, for their grandchildren, because they appreciate the American dream. Many of them have lived the American dream. Whether they're a farmer or a teacher, whether they're a lawyer, an accountant, a mom, a dad, somebody who owns a small business on Main Street in one of our 95 counties in our beautiful towns. They've lived it. They're living it every single day. Blood, sweat, tears, working long hours, investing. And they look at what is happening here in Washington, and they are saying, why are you in such a rush to force us into bankruptcy? You know, July 6, 2010, I use this statement all the time, Mr. President. Someone that you and I each know because of our work on armed services, Admiral Mullen. July 6, 2010. He was asked a question, what keeps you up at night? What is the greatest threat to our nation's freedom, our democracy? You know what he said? He said, our nation's debt. Now let me walk you back through the history of that debt. If we were to go from the time that George Washington became president up until the time that George W. Bush stepped out of office, our nation had accrued a total of $10.6 trillion in debt. Too much for me. I used to, when I would go to the White House with President Bush, I would say, Mr. President, there's two things that I think need to be addressed. Number one is the out-of-control federal spending, and number two is the issue of illegal immigration. Well, he left office $10.6 trillion in debt, but still very mild compared to what we're facing today, I think we would have to say. Now, President Obama took office, and he and Joe Biden went to work, and you know what they did in 8 years? Mr. President, they ended up just about doubling our nation's debt. Doubled it. President Trump came in, tried to pare back on regulations, cut the size of the federal government, and then we had COVID. That added to the debt, and then here comes President Biden. And it is as if the printing presses have cranked up on printing those dollar bills, running them through as fast as they possibly can. Because what the Biden administration and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have pushed through was $1.9 trillion, saying that was necessary for CARES, even though all that money that had previously been spent had not been, or had been appropriated, had not been spent. And now, here we have $1.2 trillion, and as my colleague said, it's become this bill of, here's a little bit for infrastructure, but oh, by the way, over here, here's this great big down payment on the Green New Deal. Don't worry that we don't generate enough electricity for an electric vehicle fleet. We'll figure that one out later. Let's just put in subsidies for electric vehicles. Don't worry about giving more power to the federal government. We'll give you back authority, local governments, if we think you need it. $1.2 trillion in spending. And then we hear that the bonus round in this Lollapalooza, it's going to be $3.5 trillion. But more likely, the realistic view is it's going to be $5 trillion. So, back to my point, Mr. President, people in Tennessee are saying, what in the world could you possibly be thinking? What could you possibly be thinking? Because they know the history of this nation's debt. And you know what, Mr. President, and this really relates to much of the work that we do at SASC. They know that there is a threat from the people that own or hold our debt? Japan, our friend and ally, they're at the top of the tier right now. Last time I checked last month on who owns our debt, you know, number 2 is China. They own well over $1 trillion or hold over $1 trillion of our debt. And if you put the OPEC nations together, and of course, after the Keystone Pipeline, we're now dependent on OPEC and others for fuel. We were energy independent thanks to President Trump and Republicans in the House and Senate. We were energy independent. But OPEC is there in that top 5, all those OPEC countries grouped together. So people in Tennessee are really quite, they're miffed. They're put off by what is going on. I was really surprised. I had a text this morning from one of my county mayors. I'm all for infrastructure, I'm for the Cornyn Amendment, but you know what, I'm not for this bill. Because you've got less or about 25% of this that goes for something that we would deem infrastructure. Tennesseans love to talk about infrastructure as 4 things. And they talk about roads, rivers, railways, and runways. And of course, we're a logistics state. Everyone knows Memphis has a big port and a rail hub, one of 2 cities where all 5 Class A railroads come into that city. They know that interstates are important. They crisscross our state, indeed Nashville, where you have 3 major interstates that crisscross right there in the middle of that city. They know that Tennessee, so many businesses choose to locate there because we're within an 8-hour drive of a majority of the nation's population. So logistics require good roads and rivers and rail and runways. But you know what? They're not seeing it in this. When you, in the name of infrastructure, spend this amount of money. Now, I have great respect for my colleagues on each side of the aisle that have worked to produce a product, to do it in a bipartisan way. That is commendable. It's commendable. For Tennesseans, the result is something that is frustrating to them. You know, this is considered to be the world's greatest deliberative body. I always appreciated how our former colleague, Senator Alexander, would talk about the cup and saucer. The hot coffee gets poured into the cup, it spills over into the saucer, it cools off, you add some sweetener, and you get something that you enjoy. People expect more. They expect better of this deliberative body. And Tennesseans know that our nation's freedom has been well served by robust, respectful, bipartisan debate. That's a good thing. It strengthens freedom. It brings people together. It brings them to the table to talk about what is their priority. Now, unfortunately, most of us in this body have not had the opportunity to be at that table. And amendments that we have worked on that we felt like would have improved this bill are not going to be heard. Not here, not in a hearing, in a committee. We're just not going to see that as a part of this process. That is unfortunate. And it is going to be unfortunate if, indeed, that happens on the next bill, or the bill after that, or the bill after that. We should return to regular order and go through this process. Now, I had about 30 amendments that I had offered as improvements for this bill, and Mr. President, rest assured, I'm not going to stand here and go through each and every one of those amendments. But there are some things I thought needed our attention in this bill. As many of my colleagues know, broadband is something that, whether I was serving in the House or back in the state Senate in Tennessee, or before that, going in and reorganizing a Tennessee Film, Entertainment, and Music Commission for our governor, broadband and moving from analog to digital, making high-speed internet available all across our state, closing that digital divide. I've spent so many hours working on this, and I filed 3 amendments that I felt like would really do some damage control on these and help close the divide, getting to our rural and unserved areas, people that have no internet. Amendment 2327 would have prohibited the federal government from forcing municipal broadband provider programs into states that have outlawed them. Now, Tennessee is one of those states that says to municipalities, if you want to serve people within your city, that's great, you go ahead. But you can't go outside of your boundaries. And there are other states that have had this issue. And there's a reason they say, if you serve your constituents, great, but don't go outside that. It's because states that have allowed these schemes ended up banning them for a reason. And usually it's because these government-run systems would end up imploding, leaving the taxpayers with the bill that they were going to have to pay. Now, another amendment, Amendment 2377, would have prohibited the FCC, our Federal Communications Commission, from implementing price-setting schemes on broadband providers. That, allowing the FCC to do that rate setting and price setting, would destroy investment in rural broadband. It would destroy it. We know this. And it would actually incentivize providers in avoiding these unserved areas. Sometimes we talk about that as being that last mile that needs to get that fiber, that last mile that needs fixed wireless, that last mile that is needing some form of connectivity. And Amendment 2328, and we do hope this one makes it in the bill, would strike language permitting regulators to allow these broadband grant recipients to use the money for, and I'm quoting the language in the bill, any use determined necessary to facilitate the goals of the program, end quote. Now, Mr. President, this sounds vague. It is vague. And if there's one thing that we learned prior, when we put a lot of money out during President Obama's time, is that sometimes this money ends up not being targeted to broadband, but ends up as a slush fund. We also have an amendment that would deal with a shovel-ready infrastructure project on our southern border. Amendment 2406 would redirect $1 billion from Amtrak. By the way, Amtrak's getting many billions of dollars in this bill. And it would send that money over to the Department of Homeland Security to finish the southern border wall construction. We all know what is happening on that border. Record numbers of illegal aliens coming in, many very sick, COVID positive. We know that they are ending up, as are drugs, as are gangs, in cities and towns across this nation. Indeed, until we secure this southern border, every town is a border town, every state is a border state. And God bless our law enforcement officers who are fighting this every day. I'm hearing from them, and I want them to know I hear them, and I understand the pressures that they are under. And we also know that our communities are struggling, trying to get back to work and really move forward with regrowing the economy. But inflation has gotten in the way. And one of the big problems is that people point to with the high cost of fuel and logistics and of packing materials is the killing of the Keystone Pipeline. So Amendment 2298 would amend Section 4034 of the bill, which calls for a study on job loss and impacts on consumer energy due to the revocation of the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. My amendment says that if the report shows that killing the pipeline caused numerous job losses and an impact on consumer energy cost, that the president should revoke, he shall revoke his executive order and get out of the way of the pipeline construction. Get people back to work and get the prices at the pump, get them down. Get them down to where they were when President Trump left office. I mean, what's the purpose of a report if it doesn't have any teeth? So let's take an action on that. You know, Mr. President, there is no bill that is ever perfect. They all have to be worked on. Many times we come back a year or so later and we do technical corrections on a bill. We make changes. And this is no different. This bill needs time. It needs a thorough amendment process. It needs to go back to the committees of jurisdiction to work through these issues. Are the American people for infrastructure? Yes, they are for infrastructure. Tennesseans are for infrastructure. I'm for infrastructure projects. Yes, indeed. Am I for this piece of legislation? No, because it's a document that has misplaced priorities. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll, please.
Ms. Baldwin.
I'm Aaron James Drapp.